Our next speaker is Lisa Kaeser, JD. We're back to the law. We need direction because that's how progress is made sometimes in this country. And we need to learn how to use the law and work effectively in our causes. So, Lisa is the director of the Office of Legislation and Policy at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Health and Human Development. That's known as NIDCHD. She's the liaison to the NICHD leadership and many constituents. She is the liaison to Congress, to research advocacy communities, and to the public. She has managed public and private partnerships. And then 17 years ago, she actually began as an advocate in women's health, researching it and working on policy at the Alan Guttmacher Institute, which most of us are familiar with. She also, in her past history, spent 3 years on Capitol Hill and was a representative for Jim Moody, a Democrat from Wisconsin. She has a law degree from Vermont Law School. She got her undergrad degree from Dartmouth College. And one of her new tasks that's just been assigned is on the task force research specific to pregnant women and lactating women. So I hope we'll hear more about that.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I am in the unenviable position of being between a U.S. Senator and lunch. So I will try to keep this moving and interesting for all of you. I am Lisa Kaeser, and I am from the nice job on the name, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which is one of the 27 institutes and centers at the National Institutes of Health. And I have been there almost 18 years. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So many of you may be aware that in December, just this past December, Congress passed a major new piece of legislation. It was the first one actually the first big one affecting NIH's authorization since 2006, which is a long time. It was bipartisan. That's an accomplishment these days. And it passed overwhelmingly. President Obama signed it into law on December 13th. And it's a hugely complex bill. There are many, many, many provisions. So what I'm going to do today is touch on, a couple of the ones that affect NICHD specifically, thinking that it would be of interest to you, and very specifically the task force and what we're doing with the task force. This is the formal description of what the bill is supposed to do. It was interesting, and believe it or not, this was kind of controversial, the use of the word cures. Clearly, Congress hears for the most part, from people who want cures for diseases or conditions that affect themselves or their families. That does not always get to things like prevention. There's a lot of health-related issues that are not covered in the word cures. So, and yet there were several provisions in the act that did go to prevention and other things. But I just wanted to point that out because that's when you're talking about language that you use when you talk to Congress or other policymakers, that's an important distinction to be aware of. It was Public Law 114-255, and if you're not familiar with that nomenclature, that means that was the 255th law that Congress passed in the 114th session of Congress. It was an unusual bill for another reason. Most of these bills, and I won't go into all these details, but I'd be happy to answer questions later. Most bills that are passed by Congress are authorizing bills, and that allows Congress to make tweaks to federal programs, establish new federal programs, that kind of thing. You know, basically tell the federal agencies that will be implementing it what its priorities are. Those bills traditionally do not include actual dollars. Senator Duckworth made reference to that. That function is reserved for the 12 annual appropriations bills that have to pass every year. Lately, all they've been doing is mush them all into one bill called an omnibus bill, and we think that's going to happen again this year. But this bill was very unusual in the sense that there actually was money attached, but only for these top-level projects. So these are all, the first three are at NIH. The Brain Research Initiative, it's brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies, which is a huge multi-institute effort to understand how the brain functions and do it's a lot of brain imaging and that sort of thing. PMI, the Precision Medicine Initiative, has now been renamed All of Us, and that will be a huge effort. Dr. Taylor talked earlier about epidemiology. This is to look at essentially both the medical records and genomes of 1 million people across the country, and glean information from that. It would be the largest such study ever in the United States. The cancer moonshot, a lot of you probably saw in the paper, that was something Vice President Biden is still very much involved with. And then a shorter-term project on regenerative medicine. But this is there's about $4.8 billion, yes, B, and that was the only money that's been attached to the bill. Let's just go through a few of the other revised programs. Something we heard a great deal from Congress, because Congress has heard a great deal from the academic institutions, that in terms of research, the next generation of researchers are getting very discouraged because the funding has not been great. And so a lot of senior researchers are even having trouble getting grants. So that's something Congress has been talking about, and frankly, Dr. Francis Collins, who's the director, and now, as of last night, has been asked to stay on as director. Last night that happened, yes. And so he appeared for, the run-up to cures was about 3 years. He appeared before multiple hearings, briefings, and the next generation of researchers is a major, major theme of his. So there are several provisions in the Cures Act that are really aimed at encouraging people to get into and stay into research. One example, NIH, a lot of people aren't aware of this excellent program. NIH has a loan repayment program. So for individuals who are interested in working and willing to work for the government in certain areas, such as pediatrics or clinical research, they can get their loans repaid tax-free up to $50,000 a year now. Does that interest you, maybe? just thought you might want to know about that. And interestingly, NIH also now has prize authority. It can give prizes because the traditional peer review grant application structure tends to, you have to have data to show that your grant might have a chance of succeeding. Well, this allows the really high risk but high reward research to go forward. And then there are a lot of administrative burdens that have over the years been imposed on NIH of interest to researchers. There's a huge new effort to increase the amount of data sharing. So for example, my institute has a new database called the DASH that we have posted the results and the data from 37 studies, huge studies, and it's for any researcher in the country to use. So if you're ever interested in doing secondary analyses and that sort of thing, you don't have to go out and collect those data. You can use them. And this is going to be a very growing effort at NIH. these are the 5 provisions that most directly affect NICHD, my institute. 3 of them are well underway. The first one is the National Pediatric Research Network, and that was aimed at setting up a network around the country for pediatric research for clinical trials. And what NIH has done is establish, I don't know if you're familiar with the term IDEA states, that's the Institutional Development Awards. About 23 states across the country are considered the have-nots in the sense that they haven't been as successful getting NIH funding. A lot of these states are rural, don't have huge patient populations. And so NIH already was running a large network to help those academic institutions in those states kind of get up to speed, establish really vibrant research offices, and apply for NIH funding. Well, we took advantage of that infrastructure and are establishing pediatric clinical trial teams in 17 of those states so that any child in those states with a condition where a clinical trial is being conducted can go to their own state. They don't have to fly to NIH or fly to CHOP or one of the other academic institutions. So we're hoping this is really going to help kids, especially in rural areas, participate in cutting-edge research. It also allowed NIH to establish a global pediatric network, and that effort is being led already by the FDA and industry. I'll talk about inclusion in a second. The other one that's well underway, a lot of people don't realize, but my institute has responsibility for the National Center for Medical Rehabilitation Research. And so that since 1990, that's been well established, but this bill made a lot of changes to its basic authorizing provisions. And those changes are well underway. One of the 2 that we are working on very hard, inclusion in research. So some of you may be familiar that back in the 1990s, a number of pieces of legislation actually were passed. Senator Mikulski and others were very, very instrumental in passing those because women were not included in research effort, clinical research at that point. So you'd get I'm sure you've all heard, you'd get well, women should take this much aspirin because we did a study saying that men over 200 pounds had to take this much aspirin. I mean, it was really that bad. And so NIH has had a policy first on women and minorities, then in the late 90s, they added a policy on inclusion of children. But honestly, the inclusion hasn't always been as successful. So the Cures Act asked NIH to hold a workshop focusing on 2 major groups, children, those under 18, and people in older populations, over 65, because I don't know if you've ever looked, many protocols cut off recruitment age, enrollment age, as of 55 or even younger. And think about it, we have an aging population, we have, there are a lot of reasons to do research that includes older populations as well. So the Cures Act mandated that NIH have a workshop to flesh this out, and that was just held last Thursday and Friday. So if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to send them the link. The videos will be posted very soon, and it was an unbelievably vibrant, rich discussion. It was terrific. So anyway, I thought that might be of interest to all of you. Now, the big ticket item, the most exciting thing, and I have to tell you, it's really wonderful to be working on something so positive. This is the new task force on research specific to pregnant women and lactating women. And this is the actual language from the law. There's more, but I thought you'd be interested in this. Oh, and it's in your books. Wonderful. Very, very convenient. Thank you. I want to talk about this today as a fabulous case example of what it takes, first of all, to get something into law. Senator Duckworth kind of alluded to some of that and all the obstacles and the roadblocks and the you have to try again, and, bills fail because of reasons outside your control, all sorts of things. And then what we're doing to implement it. So this is really a long-term process. People think sometimes that Congress just passes a law and, the next day it goes into effect. And that is not how it works. And I want to acknowledge, because as a federal employee, of course, I am not allowed to lobby or ask for funding. But I work closely with the outside organizations that care about our research. So in this case, it's a coalition of groups, the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics. And this is focused, this task force is focused on medications used during pregnancy and postpartum. Most people don't realize that pregnant and lactating women, on average, take between 3 and 5 prescription medications during that period. And yet, I can tell you, they have not been tested in pregnant and lactating women. And, there's no physical changes that go on during pregnancy. And so there certainly wouldn't be any reason to test them. But anyway, so we are supposed to convene this task force. The report, and this is actually for government, this is a really fast timeline. The report needs to go back to the Secretary and to Congress by September of 2018. So that's actually pretty rapid fire for us. And the task force itself, it's not one of those in perpetuity things. It's supposed to sunset after 2 years unless the Secretary chooses to extend it. Here's some of the specific topics that are required by law, including things like ethical issues and communicating to the outside public about what the findings are. This slide is courtesy of the coalition. I'm showing it to give you a sense of how long it took them to even get to passage of the law. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the steps that the coalition went through. Katie Schubert is one of the co-chairs of the coalition, so I do want to give her credit for help with this. So as you can see, they came up with the idea back in the fall of 2013. Some of you may know that since the early 2000s, there's been a federal law called the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children law, because drugs had never been tested in pediatric populations either. So between the FDA and ourselves, we're trying to help clean out the backlog of medications that kids use. But again, no one had tried doing this work in pregnant women. So they came up with this idea, and they brought the relevant parties together, and you'll probably see some very familiar organizations on this list. These are all the leading organizations that care about this issue. And there are more, too, but these folks are the ones that really made this happen. The next thing to do, and organizations, it's interesting. It's like members of Congress. I mean, people have different agendas, and they have different agendas for a reason. So the next real challenge when you do something like this is to come up with common principles, guidances that will govern everybody and that everyone can agree to. So one of the things, of course, is that they realize that research has to be conducted, that we can't keep providing prescription medications to women without some evidence base. And then, of course, you do your homework. So in 2014, the coalition brought together not only those groups and experts from those groups, mostly clinicians and others, but also the federal agencies that had a stake in this, as well as the patient groups. Because there are a lot of women who have conditions, say epilepsy, depression, schizophrenia, conditions for which they really often cannot stop taking their medications, even if they become pregnant. So it's the voices of those individuals who are critical when you're making decisions in this. And down at the bottom is the alphabet soup of government agencies who were involved as well. Then you find your champions. And, Senator Duckworth is an obvious champion for many issues related to breastfeeding. starting at the upper left there is Senator Patty Murray, Jamie Herrera Butler, who has been very public about her own experience with a very, very difficult pregnancy. And her daughter ended up having a kidney transplant and is about 2.5 years old today. But Mrs. Herrera Butler had to really, really go the extra mile to get treatment. Lucille Roybal Allard and Mrs. Herrera Butler and Lucille Roybal Allard are also the co-chairs in the House of the Maternity Caucus, which is something you should be aware of. And then Congresswoman Kathy Kaeser from Florida. Then you continue to educate. You don't just stop. You don't, once a bill is introduced, doesn't mean it's going to pass. You have to work through committee, as you probably know, the whole committee structure. You have to make sure you have the ear of the chairman, make sure you have the ear of the leadership, and really make this a bill that everyone wants to vote for. So the coalition continued to do educational efforts. Of course, they made individual congressional office visits, but they also held a number of briefings on Capitol Hill. And one of the most effective things was that I mentioned the patient voices before, they brought the patients to participate in these briefings. And that brings it home to people unlike any other way. I'm sure you've all seen congressional hearings where someone testifies and, people are wringing out their handkerchiefs by the end of it. That makes such a difference. I can talk about research and statistics and all of those important things, but honestly, there's nothing like patience. So you saw that slide before, but I hope that gives you a sense of what it took to get to this point. So now I'm going to switch just and go over briefly what we're doing to implement. So that's also not just the snap of a finger. Federal government takes a little while. So the first thing, I can't speak for other agencies, but at NIH, there is a formal legislative implementation group. And they meet because they want to look at what regulations, laws, guidances, NIH policies, all of those sorts of things. Do any of those need to be changed because of the new law? And then the nuts and bolts of actually implementing any new research program. So this is, the Responsible Institute is supposed to submit a formal legislative implementation plan, and we did that in February. Very quickly, actually, it was right during that crazy month of January when there were some other things going on in Washington. Very quickly, NIH requested and received delegation of authority. So the original legislation said this should be a secretarial level task force. It's unusual for the secretary himself to just sort of do all of that. Usually it's assigned to a specific agency. I should also make it very clear that there are many agencies outlined in the legislation that should be part of the task force. So, of course, they have all designated people to attend and provide their input. But NIH received delegation of authority in January. Dr. Kathy Spong, who's my deputy director, happens to be an OBGYN and maternal fetal medicine specialist, so it made perfect sense for her to spearhead this effort. This is kind of inside baseball, but we have to file a formal charter. The legislation kind of unusually actually set a deadline to do that, and we just met that deadline on March 13th. And we have prepared a slate of nominees from across patient groups, industry, professional societies, and of course the federal agencies for the Secretary's approval. We're also doing, we are asking all the federal agencies prior to the first meeting in August. We have asked all the federal agencies to give us a sense of what research is currently being done. So we'll have a compendium of ongoing research right now in this area. Interestingly, NIH has this wonderful reporting system, public reporting system, where you can go on the website and find out what grants are being conducted in about 260 research areas. These two weren't on it. So we have received permission. Thanks to the legislation, we've received permission to develop the reporting for both of these areas, and it should make it extremely, just so much easier for anyone to go online and find out what grants are being conducted by any of the institutes, not just my institute, any of the institutes in all of these areas. But I thought particularly for this group, the second one would be of huge interest. And it's really nice because it gives you the grant, the academic institution and primary investigator, and how much money is being spent. We're making all the announcements about the meetings in the Federal Register, and we've also set up a web page. My understanding is that the registration for the first meeting, which is August 21st, 22nd, has just been posted on our website. And do they have these slides? So, okay. But these are the dates. The first two have been publicly announced. We'll be doing an amended Federal Register notice to announce the second two, but we think those are going to be the dates. These are public meetings. I really wanted to emphasize that. Anyone who would like to come is very, very welcome. And there will be plenty of time for public comments. You can also submit written comments ahead of time. I can say that because I'm the executive secretary, so I will be getting those comments. But I really would encourage you to do that. I think the more the merrier here. And this is your chance in terms of what research needs to be done in this area. So again, I just want to acknowledge the coalition and their work, and then it takes a village. So we have a large team working just at NICHD, and of course with our sister and brother institutes across NIH, as well as the other agencies. So thank you. Anyone have any burning questions? Hi.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. Very comprehensive. Federal government is very difficult to understand. My name is Gerry Fitzgerald. I've lived in Washington for most of my adult life, so the government issues are always out there. And I was involved in an FDA task force some years ago on labeling for prescriptions for women who were pregnant and breastfeeding. And that was some time ago, and I've always thought that the FDA was the agency that looked at medications. So how much coordination are you doing? Because I have a feeling they're doing some work.
Oh, they are.
Okay,
They are.
that is going to either complement or...
First of all, the FDA is absolutely on the task force. Dr. Marjorie Jenkins actually is the representative. And yes, the reason that we got the delegation of authority in this case, because it talked about the research. So what research is needed. Let me give you the best pharmaceuticals for children as an example. There are some medications that have been used for decades, literally, by kids. Most of them are generic. And so the companies have no incentive to go back and test them in pediatric populations. It's expensive. And so those medications come to us for testing. We have a pediatric trials network, and they come to us for testing. We then submit those data, that whole data package, to the FDA. The FDA then goes back and deals with the companies to see if the labeling changes can be made. It's many more steps than that, but that should give you an idea. So absolutely, we work hand in hand with the FDA on this sort of thing. Thank you. No, it's a good clarification. Thank you. Anyone else?
First of all, as a pregnant woman and someone who works with pregnant women, thank you.
Good. You're welcome.
It's unbelievable how much is still unknown or unclear. I'm just curious, you mentioned several times that this is rolling so quickly, and I don't know if you can share, why you think that is, what's shifted to make this a priority now, and also from previous task force, what did their timelines look like going from task force to getting that research out there?
I will tell you a secret. When I first heard about this idea from some of the coalition members, I was not super wild about it because the last thing any of us need is another report that sits on a shelf. I'm really not kidding. And that truly has happened with task forces over the years that I've been involved in. You know, a couple people might have their awareness raised or whatever. This one, that's why I emphasized how they did their homework and really built a base of support, not only on the Hill, but among the groups. It really helped enormously. It frankly also helps that I think there are those of us in government who fully recognize this is a major, major need. My three directors ago at NICHD talked about pregnant women, Dr. Dwayne Alexander, he talked about pregnant women as being the last frontier. And so we've recognized that this was a problem. I think, you know, given all the congressional mandates, it's hard to take on something new that you don't have funding for. So getting this directive and establishing this task force, now what we do, and this could be another role for you all, what we do once we make those recommendations to the secretary then has 6 months to recommend regulatory or other policy changes at the HHS level. That could be a very interesting time for people to weigh in.
Should we be concerned that the task force will terminate in 2 years?
No, thank you. I truly believe that we will get a very solid report to the secretary. Now, whether the secretary thinks that he will need the expertise of task force members to, you know, depending on what he decides to do with the recommendations, he may need, especially the federal agencies, to go ahead and help him implement those changes. But that one's to be seen. That's it?
Well, I come up to ask you a question.
Oh, wonderful. I like this.
Well, we're represented here with many people from Washington, but the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine stretches across the country. And we have a real concern about how women are dealt with in any reproductive situation, but we're focused on lactation. And this is the 9th year of the summit. We come to Washington full of energy, and things have changed. Can we take credit for all of that? Of course not. But we have made a difference. I would like you to tell us what would be most important for ABM to be doing these days?
Oh, boy. Well, I have to be a little careful because I'm not really supposed to tell you to lobby. Yes, educate is a very good word. I would say, but it's a point I should have made earlier. Congress is not the only set of policymakers in Washington. There are all kinds of policymakers, and of course I'm biased, but I think of people in the federal agencies who make decisions all the time. If you're given a certain pot of money, where do you put your emphasis? What research do you do? It's really, really important. So I would say make sure you meet with the relevant federal agencies with whatever issues you have. Make sure, Senator Duckworth mentioned, people don't think about the FAA. They don't think about the Department of Labor, but make sure you meet with those folks. Of course, I would say also work in coalition. This coalition was a wonderful example of maximizing your impact because they also have members from around the country. And so you put everyone together, that's a real voice. And I think that's the most effective thing to do. Does that help?
Okay. Well, that's certainly a help, and we need all the help we can get. Carla?
I'm going to go behind. Let Dr. Young go first.
Okay. Michael Young,
Okay.
Howard University. One last question.
Sure.
I'm sure a lot of clinicians use the LACMed component of ToxNet from the National Library of Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they fit in this process, and Are they at the table? Will they be used as a mechanism to roll out?
I don't know about the rollout because those we haven't met, so I don't know what those but absolutely. So National Library of Medicine has a new director, and I believe my director, Dr. Bianchi, has already talked with her. But yes, thank you for raising that. We've made it very clear to any of the NIH institutes there are going to be 4 other institutes sitting on the task force, but there are plenty of others who may be interested. We chose the ones with the largest portfolios that were relevant to this mission. So thank you for raising that.
Given the huge amount of money in the Brain Initiative and the Precision Medicine Initiative, is there any wedge in there for issues related to breastfeeding and women's health?
I'm trying to think how you'd make the connection with the brain.
Right. Well, the good thing is that at least one of the leaders of the Brain Initiative is a woman,
well,
so that's
helps.
helpful.
That helps. I could see more. So Eric Dishman is the head of all of us, the precision medicine. And, he's a data guy. He's from Intel. Very unusual background for someone at NIH. And he's been fabulous about meeting with people. So it might not be a horrible idea to go talk to him. And because I will tell you that internally, we have been talking with them a lot because at first, I'll be honest, kids weren't automatically included. And so we're like, excuse us, we're child health. Kids need to be included in this. So it's, and I think it's a question of resources and just how it rolls out. But it seems to me it would be helpful to know now what what the interests are, so that you can at least get in that rollout plan. That would be, yeah, I don't think he'll care, but. Yeah.
And let me just put in a plug for breastfeeding in terms of precision medicine. Precision medicine isn't just based upon genetics, but it's also based upon epigenetics.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of evidence right now about the importance of breastfeeding and epigenetics.
Bring that up with Dr. Dishman. Yes.
Well, I'd like to add a piece of information because we've talked about brain growth several times this morning. And people who don't want to believe it are always saying, well, we did a study somewhere and a lot of the kids were equal and all. And he has, not shown clearly that it makes a difference to the brain. Thank you. And I think that the research that has been done on imaging the brain is so clear that they've done newborns and a few month old and so forth, infants who were being breastfed compared to those who were receiving formula. And the brains are already so different. You can't deny what you see on imagery. I mean, you can add up the intelligence tests and things like that, but this is undisputable. So I mention this because as you fight these battles, you can drag up this research because it's in print and defend the cause.
So our representative to that group, the brain group, is Dr. Lisa Freund, who is chief of our child development and behavior branch, and she's pretty basic researcher, and that's exactly what she looks at is growth and development of the brain. So thank you. I'll make sure she's bringing that in.
Well, I was at a meeting of the FDA not so long ago, and they were unaware.
Really?
So I gave them a reference.
Okay. Good for you. All right, thank you very much.